Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be invited to address you this afternoon, and thank you, William, for those tremendously kind words. I only wish they were true, but I'm not a member of the SDP, but I just want to congratulate you all, actually, on such a fantastic conference today. I mean, it's a really splendid affair, and all those who've been involved in putting it together, I think, deserve a warm round of applause. And I should say, it really is a genuine pleasure to be with you all today. I mean, speakers always say that, but this time, actually, I do really mean it for once. Because although I'm always happy to speak to any political party, whoever invites me, well, almost any political party, I do feel that I'm around friends, kindred spirits, people who share the same worldview as me, people who have the same love of nation and love of the British people, but also people who really do have a similar concern also for the betterment of all people in our society. And given that the average British voter leans slightly left on the economy, but right on social and conservative issues, it's always been a great mystery to me that in this country we've never had a dominant party in British politics equivalent to something like the French Gaullist parties, which are strong on defence, strong on immigration, strong on culture, but yet have a heart and believe in a social safety net and believe in looking after every strata of our society. But the SDP does have the potential to be precisely that sort of a party because it is so closely aligned with the British voter. And so I therefore feel that for the SDP, there are great days ahead. However, the question in a conference about rebuilding Britain is whether there are great days ahead for Britain itself. Now, earlier this year, we had the economy talked down by Rachel Reeves, who then panicked and in her sort of automaton, inimitable, monotone way said, Britain's greatest days are ahead of it. But she then, of course, unleashed the most devastating budget in recent history. And for many people today, of course, Britain's myriad problems, the consequences of mass immigration, the ideological capture of our institutions and their corruption, the indoctrination of our children and so forth, it's very difficult to see precisely when and how Britain is ever going to enter into those broad sunlit uplands that we've been promised by politicians. So do our greatest days really lie ahead? Well, it's unlikely that Britain's ever going to dominate and straddle the globe and have its flag flying over a quarter of the world and rule the seas and be the main economic and military power. So if we're going to equate greatest days with greatest power, then no, our greatest days are behind us. But I would humbly submit that that is the wrong perspective. Because when we say greatest days, it's greatest days for whom? Because for countless millions of people who lived in our greatest era of Pax Britannica, their life was one of extreme hardship. Appalling poverty, a hand-to-mouth existence, slum accommodations, brutal working conditions, no health care. There were very few great days in the East End of 19th and early 20th century London. The people today have greater days than they did. But what about within our own lifetimes? Can the next 70 years be as great as the last 70, or even better? Well, it's far from easy, and that's quite an understatement, I would say. But if the will and the determination are there, and if the policies are there, then I say yes. If we begin to rebuild Britain along the lines you've discussed today at this conference, and rebuild it more broadly and more fundamentally across all other aspects of national life, restoring, reviving, and restructuring our culture, our society, our demographics, our infrastructure, our economy, then I don't have any doubt that we can have great days ahead. Certainly greater than we're now enduring and that we have endured for the better part of this century so far. And you're very fortunate that your party understands this, because your party's very well thought out platform policies offer a real transformative root and branch reform of the nation state. And I think well-deserved congratulations to you on that. But policies in and of themselves aren't enough. Before we get there, before we can implement those, we need a change in the mentality of the nation. We have to change the dominant narrative. It's a narrative that we've had since the 1950s, but it's particularly strong today, that Britain is a nation in an inescapable spiral of perpetual decline. Now, in the years since the Second World War, Britain has undeniably slipped down the global rankings on many key indices, but I hasten to add, only slightly. For example, in 1965, Britain was the world's 5th largest economy. 60 years later, today, in 2025, we're the 6th largest economy. So we've only slipped down one mark in 60 years, and that's only because of India and China arriving on the scene. Were they not here, we would be in a higher ranking than we were in 1965, with the 4th largest economy in the year. We know that in the post-Cold War 21st century, we've seen massive decline in army military forces and personnel. But aside from troop deployments, what does that really mean? Well, according to the global firepower ranking of the world's most powerful nations, in 2005, Britain was the world's 6th largest power. 20 years later, despite all the massive cuts of the past 2 decades, we're still the world's 6th most powerful country. Let's look at another powerful comparison. According to the World Intellectual Property Organization, Britain ranks 4th in the Global Innovation Index. And if you dig deeper, you find that we are ranked 2nd in the world for creative output, and we're 3rd for market specialization, such as help and support with startups. And of course, when it comes to Nobel Prize, which are awarded each year, Britain still ranks number 2, behind only America. And that's a status we've held for decades unchanging. In fact, it used to be the case that at the Athenaeum Club in Pall Mall, which is an exclusive gentleman's club for scientists, there were more living members holding the Nobel Prize in that club than in the whole of France, which gives me great pleasure. But that's no longer the case. But Oxford and Cambridge still have more living Nobel Prize winners than the whole of France. So in other words, as dark and as terrible as things may seem right now, and despite all the huge challenges that we face, Britain's global position has remained remarkably stable. And if you ignore the anomaly of how well America has done in the last 20 years, we continue to be a leading great power that easily holds its own against the other great powers who have always historically been our adversaries. So we must unabashedly celebrate our strengths, celebrate that record, and preach that positive message as widely as possible in the hope of reviving here the spirit of can-do optimism in this nation, and to demonstrate that despite all of the destructive policies and the catastrophic mismanagement of successive governments, ours need not be a story of woeful decay and inevitable decline, because the foundations upon which Britain will be rebuilt remain as strong and resilient as ever. So let us unleash the best of Britain, because remember, no country in modern history has had a greater or more positive impact on the world. Indeed, Britain created the modern world, and the evidence is all around us. Now let's just remind ourselves of what we were capable of achieving in the past and how it should inspire us into the future. The Industrial Revolution, that was the greatest leap forward for mankind in 12,000 years, since man first adopted agriculture in the Neolithic period. The spread of capitalism. Now, nothing has done more to lift the world out of poverty and raise global living standards than capitalism. Now, Britain didn't invent capitalism. You can look to Italy and the Dutch for that. But we invented industrial capitalism, and the British Empire was the vehicle that globalized capitalism. Look at the invention of the railways and urban mass subways. Fundamentally transformed societies around the world, led to the creation of nations like Canada, India, Australia, and of course the expansion of America. The common law and the rule of law and due process. The notion of English, later British liberty. Now, English liberty is very different to classical notions of Greek and Roman liberty. The global understanding of things like freedom, about the property rights, about understanding the rights of the individual, free speech, all of that derives from English liberty. In fact, the notion of individuality itself, you can trace much of that down to Britain. And if you look now at the world's most individualistic countries, the top 5 are the Anglosphere, Kanzuk, and the Five Eyes nation are the world's most individualistic. Parliamentary democracy and presidential democracy. Those are the two main forms of democracy in the world. They were both born out of British origins. Even American presidential democracy was born out of the English colonial system. And of course, the English language. English is the true global language. It's the real lingua franca, and I think we should stop saying lingua franca and say lingua anglia, not least because it annoys the French. And of course, the British Empire, which was the means by which we were able to transport our great achievements and our great gifts to the four corners of the globe. And yes, we can mention the World Wide Web, all the inventions, the medical and scientific discoveries. Now, that's not just nostalgia to look at the back and at those memories. That is ample proof that when Britain summons its purpose, it can do extraordinary things. Because the talent, the ingenuity and the genius that drove Britain to such lofty heights in the past is not extinct. It still exists today within the British character and within its greatest asset, the British people. Now, if allowed to flourish, they can and shall propel Britain to greatness once more. But to achieve that, to release all of that, we must loosen the restraints that have hindered our nation's progress. For example, we heard today that the truly jaw-dropping fact that over the last 20 years, rising energy prices have cost Britain an average of £146 billion every year in lost output. And I was amazed to learn that that equals an astonishing £3 trillion, a figure that's higher than our British national debt. In fact, it's higher than our entire GDP today. So this conference has very clearly demonstrated, I would say beyond a doubt, that allowing this multi-decade energy crisis to take place has been the most ruinous, dare I say scandalous, error in British economic history, and it's impoverished all. So tackling and correcting that error in the way that you heard outlined earlier today would not only fundamentally reshape our economic life by providing obviously stability and greater output and productivity and therefore obviously boosting the economy, but it would also be the engine of change to reshape so many other aspects and factors of national life, far beyond economics. Because as you heard today, and if you look at this SDP manifesto, you can quite see there that affordable energy is the fuel that can enable our society, our culture, and our nation to progress forward into those broad, sunlit uplands, because a nation cannot be successful, cannot afford to be successful if it is energy poor. So how do I envisage a rebuilt Britain, one perhaps built using your policies? Well, a rebuilt Britain would have a thriving economy with high productivity across all regions, northern towns, rural communities, the cities of the south, all sending innovations to market, exporting globally. It would be energy abundant with clean and reliable energy, clean air and water, a countryside preserved and in which food and farming are vibrant. It would have schools turning out students who are not only literate and numerate, but creative, critical, and technically competent. Universities would retain their global dominance whilst championing free speech. It would have a healthcare system that cares, that heals, that delivers, and a welfare system that protects dignity whilst rewarding work. It would have a justice system that is swift and fair, local communities that are empowered, immigration that enriches, and a government that serves rather than frustrates. A rebuilt Britain would have homes that people can afford to live in, transport and connectivity that bring people together, and a culture and an identity that bind people together. Its tax system would be fair, wealth creation would be actively encouraged with no one left behind, and we would have pride in work, in family, and in nation. And that is how I and any sensible person would and should envisage a rebuilt Britain. But on the day-to-day level then, what would life be like in this New Jerusalem, this shining city on the hill? Well, let's imagine a tourist or an expat arriving in Britain in 2040, having last visited in the 2020s when Labour imploded after Chancellor of the Exchequer Diane Abbott tried to topple Prime Minister Sadiq Khan. Well, if you're going to have a fantasy, at least make it entertaining, you know. With a strong economy fueling impressive growth, a tourist arriving in a future Britain would see a nation that looks more attractive, which feels more dynamic, more confident and welcoming. There's a feeling of optimism, positivity and self-confidence in the air. Thanks to investment, the revitalized towns and cities of this island with new infrastructure and public services that actually work are impressive to behold. An understanding of the importance of the broken window theory has dramatically reduced levels of antisocial behavior. Neighborhoods are also cleaner and safer thanks to no-nonsense criminal sanctions and more police. Crucially, those police are stronger, fitter, and more agile. And they're not... and they're restricted to policing streets, not tweets. And importantly, it's noticeable that the streets and the squares that the police now patrol prioritize aesthetics. Beauty begets beauty, ugliness begets ugliness. Depressing cityscapes make us depressed. So strolling around town, this tourist is busily taking photographs of the traditional and vernacular architecture that has been reintroduced. Today's bland, anonymous international architecture of chrome and steel and the ugly buildings of previous decades have been replaced or, where possible, resurfaced with stonework and facades beautifully crafted from natural materials. The new... The new public art, the new statues and memorials no longer serve to shock either. Instead, they inspire and lift the spirit. Surrounded by so much beauty, the tourist feels happier for some reason. His soul feels nourished. And continuing his tour around, he notes that Britain is just about beginning to feel a bit more harmonious, more socially cohesive, possibly even slightly more homogeneous. A robust immigration policy towards legal migration aimed at achieving negative net immigration, where more people leave than arrive, combined with the mass deportation of illegal migrants, the use of British overseas terraces for processing others, and the withdrawal from the ECHR and the 1951 Convention on Refugees has provided Britain finally with the breathing space to enable us to integrate those who are here and still need integration help. And this in turn, of course, helps to restore social cohesion to our towns and cities. White flight has ended. And combined with a crackdown on antisocial behavior, on shoplifting, on gang culture, civility is slowly returning to urban life as Britain begins to replenish its formerly high stores of high social trust. Now, high social trust is how you can depend on or rely or trust your neighbors, and it's one of the key prerequisites, one of the key indicators for economic prosperity, for community cohesion, and more broadly for social and cultural strength. And as our tourist stands in an orderly bus queue in central London, something he's never seen before, he prays that this high social trust policy will actually succeed, and he's instantly gratified when he gets on the bus and someone offers him a seat. And then he pops into a national museum, and the tourist is amazed to see displays that actually celebrate British history and British heroes and British culture. Not in any jingoistic manner, but simply acknowledging, as a matter of fact, Britain's many great achievements. You know, as used to happen from once upon a time. There was a brief mention of slavery in the empire, but at least it was balanced, and it also discussed the pros of the British Empire as well as the negatives. This, the tourist mused, was evidence clearly that there was a reverse of the long march through the institutions taking place, and he wondered whether similar positive changes were evident in Britain's other institutions, the judiciary, the civil service, the BBC, to name but three. For lunch, the tourist pops into a pub garden for a sausage roll and a smoke. The friendly English barman tells him that thanks to strong policies on immigration and housing, the housing market has been revolutionized and he's now able to buy a home. Can you afford to buy a home on a bar staff salary? Well, yes, we can actually, because with British jobs for British people and having severed the connection with low-skilled mass immigration, we are now paid a decent wage, both me and my care assistant wife. And he's delighted that family homes are finally being prioritised for British people and that young people now finally have the means to feel more invested in society by owning property, reducing their interest in the political parties of the far left and their politics of grievance that Britain and capitalism have failed them. Sipping on a pint, the tourist then opens a newspaper someone's left behind, and he reads that the London School of Economics is to confer honorary doctorates on J.K. Rowling and Douglas Murray. It's funny how universities have become much more tolerant and welcoming following the threat of government funding cuts if free speech and diversity of opinion are not actively promoted. And British schools have also changed. The government policies have ended the left's stranglehold over teacher recruitment and teacher training, restoring the far more neutral left-right balance that we had in the 1980s. The new curriculum now promotes the unbiased chronological teaching of history, as well as the respect for diversity of opinion, and with that, the ideological indoctrination of British youth has ended. Gen A, the generation following Gen Z, are proving that they are alpha by nature as well as by name, because they've been taught to be strong and resilient, and they've rebelled against the embarrassing safe space, snowflake culture of those ancient millennials and Gen Zs, Zoomers. And having been taught the importance of our fundamental freedoms and liberties, and how close we were to losing our freedoms in the dystopian insanity of the 2020s, they now cherish their cultural inheritance and will defend it to the death. Because, oh yes, they've now begun to join the army again because they are young patriots. And our tourist understands that all this is vitally important because one cannot win the battle for Britain and the West if one doesn't first win the battle for young minds. And as his plane taxis away onto Heathrow Airport's third runway, no, I'm lying, of course, they're still discussing it in 2040. But as he departs the UK, he thinks it's remarkable that Britain, a country that looked so broken, so defeated in the 2020s, could have turned things around quite so quickly. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that picture may seem implausible, indeed utterly fantastical, a faraway dream, but I'm sure that's precisely what Lee Kuan Yew, the father of modern Singapore, was told when he first spoke about making Singapore like Britain. When Lee visited London in the 1940s, he went to Trafalgar Square and he was amazed at the sight of people buying newspapers from a big pile with no newspaper seller. They took a paper, they left their money in an open box, they took change out if they needed to, no papers were stolen, the money box wasn't stolen. He said, that's the sort of civilized society I want to create back home. And to achieve that dream, to create the modern success story of high-trust Singapore, a global success, that required moral courage and immense political bravery. It required strict policies and draconian laws implemented with an iron will and a resolute determination. And it worked. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not beyond the realms of possibility to achieve something similar here. 2020's Britain is vastly different to 1940s Singapore. We already have the culture, the society, the people, the infrastructure. We even have the policies. Those are the raw materials of greatness. But greatness does not happen by accident. It requires leadership, bravery, and the resolute determination to forge them and see the task through. Because certainly something must be done. Inaction is not an option. To quote Ray Jenkins, one of the founders of this party, there are hazards in everything one does, but there are greater hazards in doing nothing. Another great statesman, Ronald Reagan, once had a political campaign called Morning in America, and it stressed a feeling of rising hope and optimism, and a sense of rising to those challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to bring morning to Britain. We are the heirs of empire and enlightenment, of Shakespeare and Newton, of pit-nosed miners who swung pickaxes in the dark, of explorers who charted the map of the world, of men who founded liberty and of other men who died defending that liberty. And all this legacy is not mere ornament. It is fuel. It is the foundation of who we are. Yes, those were great days, but I have myself full confidence that when we rebuild Britain, and I have no doubt that we shall, we will usher in a new age not only of great days, but of greater lives for everyone. Thank you. Thank you.